Disclaimer: this is a fictional dramatization created for artistic, emotional, and educational storytelling purposes. All characters and events are entirely fictional and created using AI tools. No impersonation, misrepresentation, or harm is intended. The content contains scenes of danger involving child characters. However, no real persons or minors were involved in its production. Grace's Love Stories produces scripted, AI-generated stories that promote, entertain, inspire kindness, and emotional connection. We respect our viewers and strictly adhere to YouTube's policies.
The full moon was a merciless silver eye, watching the shame of the scentless. It hung in the black sky, a celestial witness to the hollow space inside Marwen Kaldis, where a wolf should have been. Around her, the Black Creek pack thrummed with a primal energy she could only observe, a ghost at her own people's feast. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meat, pine smoke, and the heady musk of shifters drunk on lunar power scents she perceived as a human would, muted and flat, a language she could hear but never speak. She was an Omega, but worse than that, she was a void. Torvin, the pack's lead beta, slammed a wooden tankard down on the table near her, sloshing bitter ale onto her worn tunic. He didn't apologize. He never did. His mate, Lyra, smirked, her wolfish eyes glittering with casual cruelty. "Careful, blank scent," she sneered, her voice loud enough for the nearby shifters to hear. "You might wash away what little of you is there." Laughter rippled through the rest, clearing. The words were old barbs, worn smooth with use, but they pierced Marwen just as sharply as they had the first time. Blank scent, wolfless, a broken thing. She kept her head down, her gaze fixed on the dark, spreading stain on her clothes. Her hands, hidden in her lap, trembled. To react was to give them a victory. To remain still was to invite more scorn. It was a cage with no door. "Leave her be," grumbled old Elspeth, the pack's healer, though there was no real force behind the words. Pity was a coin with two sides, and both felt like charity. Marwen's throat tightened, a familiar knot of unshed tears and unspoken fury. She could feel the moon's pull, a phantom limb aching for a body that wasn't hers. For others, it was a call to the wild, a glorious surrender to instinct. For her, it was a reminder of her profound, cellular failure. On her 18th birthday, when the moon had demanded her shift, her body had seized and trembled, but her bones had not broken and reformed. Her skin had not split to reveal the fur beneath. There had been only pain, silence, and the Alpha's verdict. Defective. She risked a glance at Alpha Borin, who sat near the central fire, gnawing on a rib. He was a coarse, pragmatic leader who saw his pack in terms of strength and utility. Marwen was neither. He met her eyes for a fraction of a second, his expression flat and dismissive, before turning back to his conversation. She was a stone in his shoe, an unpleasantness to be ignored until it could be discarded. The cold of the night seeped deeper into her bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. This was the cold of absolute solitude. Humiliation was a slow-acting poison, and tonight she had drunk her fill. Pushing back from the rough-hewn bench, Marwen rose. Her movements were quiet, practiced, designed to draw as little attention as possible. She slipped away from the firelight, her form swallowed by the encroaching shadows of the ancient pines. No one called after her. No one ever did. She walked until the sounds of the pack, the laughter, the growls, the boastful stories faded into a dull murmur behind her. Here, the forest was different. It was sacred and silent. The moonlight filtered through the dense canopy, dappling the mossy ground in shifting patterns of silver and black. She followed a barely there trail to her sanctuary, a small, rocky outcrop that overlooked the vast, sleeping valley. The wind was stronger here, a lonely sigh that whipped strands of her dark hair across her face. This was the only place she felt whole. Here, she was not the blank scent Omega. She was just Marwen. Here, the silence didn't mock her. It held her. She sat on a cold, flat stone, pulling her threadbare cloak tightly around her shoulders. Below, the world was a tapestry of shadow and light. Far in the distance, the jagged peaks of the northern range clawed at the star-dusted sky. His mountains. A sharp, familiar pain lanced through her chest. Rowan. The name was a ghost on her tongue, a memory she fought to bury every day. The Alpha King of the North, the scarred ruler of the Winterfang clan, the boy who had once promised her forever under a summer moon just like this one. before he had shattered that promise, before he had severed their budding bond and cast her out with nothing but a cold, final decree. Forget my name, forget this mountain. You are nothing to me now. He had saved her, they said, exiled her from his court and sent her to this forgotten pack on the edge of the territories to protect her from the rivals who saw their bond as a weakness to exploit. But his salvation felt like damnation. He had cut away the part of her that connected to him, and in doing so, had silenced her wolf forever. He had left her broken, scentless, alone. Tears welled, hot and stinging, but she refused to let them fall. Crying was a luxury she couldn't afford. Instead, she did the only thing that ever soothed the ache. She opened her mouth, and she sang. It wasn't a song of the pack, full of blood and glory. It was hers alone, a melody born of sorrow and longing. The notes were soft at first, a fractured whisper that seemed to steal the warmth from her own breath. It was a lament for a ghost wolf, for a phantom touch, for a love that had become a scar. Her voice, the only part of her that still felt truly alive, rose into the night air. It coiled around the silent trunks of the pines, climbed the cold stone, and drifted out over the valley. She sang of silence and echoes, of a name buried under snow, of a heart that beat in a cage of bone. It was a desperate, beautiful, and utterly hopeless sound. As the melody swelled, a strange thing happened. The wind died, the chirping of the crickets ceased, the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth fell away. A profound, unnatural stillness descended upon the forest, a silence so deep it felt like the world was holding its breath. Marwen faltered, her voice catching in her throat. The sudden quiet was unnerving, heavy with an ancient, waiting presence. The air grew colder, charged with an energy that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. Her human senses, sharp as they were, screamed a single word: predator. But this was no bear or mountain cat. This was something more. Then she smelled it. A scent, impossibly, wonderfully, terrifyingly. A scent cut through her own olfactory emptiness. It wasn't the smell of the pack below. This was the scent of winter frost on granite, of ancient pine forests shrouded in mist, of cold, clean snow, and the faint, metallic tang of old blood and ozone. It was a scent of absolute power, of undisputed authority. It was the scent of a king. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the sudden silence. Her breath hitched. It couldn't be. After all these years. He wouldn't. He couldn't. A twig snapped in the shadows behind her. The sound was as loud as a thunderclap in the nay. Oppressive stillness. Marwen froze, every muscle in her body screaming at her to run, but her feet felt rooted to the stone. She slowly, so slowly, turned her head. He stepped from the curtain of darkness into a pool of stark moonlight. The stories, the whispers, they had done him no justice. He was larger than any man she had ever seen, a being carved from the mountain itself. Broad shoulders stretched the fabric of his dark, simple tunic. Scars mapped the hard planes of his face and neck, testaments to a life of brutal conflict. One jagged line cut through his left eyebrow and disappeared into his hairline, a pale track against his tanned skin. His hair was the color of a winter storm cloud, streaked with silver at the temples, and it fell unbound around his face, but it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of molten amber, glowing with a faint, inner light. They were the eyes of the wolf, ancient and intelligent, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that burned through the cold night air. King Rohnhalvik. Time seemed to stop. The moon, the stars, the very rotation of the earth held still. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched her. His expression a mask of something she couldn't name, pain, fury, and a deep, soul-shaking hunger. He took one slow, deliberate step forward, then another. The forest floor seemed to tremble beneath his weight. Marwen's mind was a whirlwind of terror and a desperate, traitorous joy. He was here. The man who had broken her was standing before her, real and solid and breathing the same air. The bond he had severed, the one that had left a gaping wound in her soul, suddenly flared to life, a phantom echo of what it once was. It was a searing, agonizing pulse that shot through her from her core to her fingertips. She finally found her voice, but it was a strangled, broken thing. "What are you doing here?" His gaze dropped to her throat, as if he could see the notes of her song still shimmering in the air. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble, the sound of stones grinding together deep within the earth. It was a voice that had commanded armies and brought alphas to their knees. It was the voice that had whispered her name in the dark, So long ago. Your song, he said, and the words seemed to be torn from him. It called me. He took another step, closing the distance between them until he was only an arm's length away. The scent of him was overwhelming, a dizzying storm of power and memory that made her sway on her feet. He lifted a hand, his scarred, calloused fingers reaching for her, not with aggression, but with a kind of desperate reverence. Marwan, he breathed her name, and it was an apology, a curse, and a prayer all at once. What have you done? His eyes flared, the amber deepening to a burning gold, and as his fingers hovered just inches from her cheek, she saw it on the back of his hand. A faint, silvery mark, a swirling rune of the bondmate, began to glow, with a soft, ethereal light, pulsing in perfect time with her own terrified heartbeat. The bond he had claimed to sever was not dead, it was awake, and it was screaming. The glowing mark was a brand of silver fire against his skin, a ghost come back to haunt the living. Marwan stared at it, her mind a hollow chamber where a scream was trying to form. The swirling rune, the symbol of a mated pair, pulsed with a soft, lunar light, a light that mirrored the frantic, terrified rhythm of her own heart. It was impossible, a lie made manifest. He had promised her it was gone, destroyed. The ritual had been brutal, a violation of magic and soul. She had felt it die inside her, a tearing agony that had left behind the silence, the scentless void. Rowan snatched his hand back as if her gaze had burned him. The light flickered and died, plunging the back of his hand into shadow once more, but the afterimage was seared into her vision. He took a half step back, and for the first time, the formidable king of the north looked shaken, his composure fractured by the very magic he swore he had unmade. The amber fire in his eyes was banked, replaced by a dawning horror that mirrored her own. It should not have, he began, his voice a low growl of disbelief. He clenched his fist, the knuckles white. It was severed. The word severed snapped the paralysis that held her. A raw, ragged fury surged through her, hot and cleansing. It was an emotion she hadn't felt with such purity in years. A rage that finally overwhelmed the shame. Liar, she whispered, the word sharp as a shard of ice. It grew louder, fueled by 5 years of cold nights and colder glares. Liar, she cried, her voice cracking. She stumbled back, putting the width of the rocky outcrop between them. The wind whipped her hair across her face, stinging her cheeks. You stood before your elders and you told me it was done. You told me the bond was ash, that the connection was broken to keep me safe. You let them call me defective. You let my own pack think I was born broken. Every word was a stone she threw at him, and he stood there and took them, his face once again an unreadable mask of granite. His stillness only enraged her further. She wanted him to flinch, to deny it, to show some flicker of the man who had once traced the lines of her palm and promised her 1,000 sunrises. Why? She demanded, her voice breaking on a sob of pure frustration. Why lie about that? Wasn't the exile enough? Wasn't leaving me scentless and empty enough for you? Did you have to leave this ghost inside me too? He finally moved, his large frame seeming to shrink the space around them. It was not a lie, he said, his tone grim, heavy with the weight of his crown. The ritual was performed. The bond was silenced, put to sleep. It was meant to be permanent, a death of sorts. We thought it was. We? The word was acid on her tongue. You and your mages? You decided my fate in a closed room, and then cast me aside like a flawed weapon. I did it to save your life, he bit out, a flash of the Alpha King's fire returning to his eyes. My rivals were circling. They saw you in Omega. Not of a high bloodline. Bonded to the new king as a vulnerability, a tool to be used against me. They would have torn you apart to get to my throne. The severing, the exile. It made you invisible. It made you safe. Safe, she laughed, a bitter, broken sound that the wind snatched away. You call this safe? Living as a ghost in my own skin? Enduring the scorn of my pack every single day? I am a walking wound, Rowan, a constant reminder of what I've lost. You didn't save me. You just chose a slower death for me. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering along the hard line of it. The scar through his eyebrow seemed to darken. There was no other way. There is always another way, she shot back, her body trembling with the force of her conviction. You were just too much of a coward to find it. It was easier to cut me off, to cauterize the wound and pretend I never existed. The accusation hung in the frigid air between them. He didn't deny it. The silence that followed was more damning than any confession. He simply watched her, his gaze intense, searching. It felt as if he were peeling back the layers of the years, looking for the girl she used to be beneath the shell of the woman she had become. "Your song," he said again, his voice softer now, laced with a rough, aching confusion. No magic, no ritual, should have been undone by a simple song. But when you sang, it was like a hook in my soul. It pulled. I was miles from here, on my own lands, and I felt it wake up. My wolf. He has been restless for years, a phantom pacing the cage of my heart. Tonight, he broke free. He ran, and he did not stop until he found the source. He looked at her, and the raw honesty in his eyes stole her breath. Until he found you. The fury within her faltered, making way for a dentry, cold, creeping dread. Her voice, the one thing that was hers, the one comfort she had in her desolate world, was a beacon that could summon the man who had destroyed it. The irony was so cruel it was almost poetic. "You have to stop," he commanded, his kingly authority returning. "Do not sing like that again. Not under the full moon. You don't understand what you're doing. You are stirring something that must remain dead." "And if I don't?" she challenged, lifting her chin. A reckless, desperate spark ignited within her. For the first time in 5 years, she held a sliver of power over him. It was a terrifying, intoxicating feeling. His eyes darkened, the amber bleeding into a deep, dangerous gold. He closed the distance between them in 2 long, silent strides. Marwan's back hit the cold, unyielding surface of a pine tree at the edge of the outcrop. He didn't touch her, but he was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a furnace against the night's chill. He crowded her, his scent a thick, dizzying cloud of winter and power. It filled her lungs, bypassed her human senses, and spoke directly to the hollow space inside her. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. His breath was a warm mist in the cold air. "If you do it again," he growled, the sound vibrating through her chest, "I will come, every single time. My wolf will not be denied, and if I keep coming to this territory, Boren will notice. Other alphas will notice. The very enemies I sent you away to escape will smell my presence here, and they will start asking why the Alpha King of the North is visiting a backwater pack on the edge of the world. They will find you, Marwan, and the safety I bought with both our souls will be for nothing." His proximity was a physical assault. Her senses, so long dulled, were screaming. The phantom bond ached, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated from her sternum to the tips of her fingers. She could almost feel the ferocious, possessive power of his. Wolf, a great beast of snow and shadow, its golden eyes fixed on her through his. She found herself staring at his mouth, at the hard line of his lips. A memory, sharp and vivid, struck her, the press of those same lips against hers, softer then, hesitant, full of a young man's promises. The ghost of that kiss was a fire on her skin. "They say you are scentless," he murmured, his voice dropping lower still, a rough, intimate sound that was meant for her alone. His gaze swept over her, lingering on the pulse beating frantically in her throat. "They are fools. You are not scentless to me. You never were." Her breath caught. Of all the things he could have said, this struck the deepest. What do I smell of?" The question was a bare whisper, a plea for a truth she had been denied her entire life. His eyes closed for a brief second, as if he were savoring a forbidden aroma. "You smell of heather after a rainstorm, of whetstone and moonlight, and sorrow. So much sorrow it could drown a man." He opened his eyes, and the raw hunger in them made her forget how to breathe. "It is the only scent my wolf has ever known as home." Without thinking, driven by an instinct she thought had died, she raised a trembling hand. She needed to touch him, to feel the solid reality of him, to confirm this wasn't some moon-mad dream. Her fingers brushed the rough stubble on his jaw. The moment her skin met his, a jolt of pure energy, white-hot and blinding, shot through them both. It was not a memory, it was the bond itself, lashing out like a live wire. He flinched violently, a guttural snarl tearing from his throat. He grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron, pulling her hand away from his face. The contact of his palm on her skin was another explosion of sensation, a flood of shared feeling, his bone-deep loneliness, his crushing burden of leadership, the relentless ache of their separation. She saw flashes behind her eyes, a throne room of cold stone, a blood-stained battlefield under a gray sky, a lone wolf howling on a frozen peak. She cried out, overwhelmed, and tried to pull away, but his grip was unbreakable. He was staring down at their joined hands, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "This," he ground out, his voice thick with pain and something else, something terrifyingly close to desire. "This is why you must stop. It is not dead. It is a starving thing, and you are feeding it." A sharp, piercing howl split the night. It was not the familiar, rough call of the Black Creek Pack. This was a call of military precision, clean and sharp, a signal. Rowan's head snapped up, his attention instantly diverted. He looked north, toward his own lands. The king returned, the tormented man swallowed by the stoic alpha. He released her wrist as if it were burning him. The sudden loss of contact left her skin cold and tingling. "I have to go," he said, his voice once again flat and commanding. He took a step back, putting a torturous distance between them. The air rushed in to fill the void, cold and empty. He turned to leave, a great shadow preparing to melt back into the forest. "Roan," she called out, her voice desperate. He paused, his back to her. "Was any of it real?" she asked, the question of a girl who had died 5 years ago. "The promises? The summer by the lake? Or was I always just a weakness you planned to cut away?" He stood there for a long moment, a statue of regret against the moonlight. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, with an emotion he could not hide. "Everything was real," he said, without turning around. "That was the problem." And then he was gone. He didn't run. He simply vanished into the deep shadows between the trees, as silent as the mist. The unnatural stillness he had brought with him dissipated, and the sounds of the forest rushed back in the crickets, the wind, the distant, muffled sounds of her pack. The scent of him, of frost and pine and power, lingered in the air, a phantom presence that was almost as overwhelming as he had been. Marwen stood shaking, her back pressed against the rough bark of the tree. Her wrist burned where he had held it. Her lips tingled with the memory of a kiss that had never happened tonight. She was no longer just the blank scent Omega. She was the woman who smelled of sorrow. She was the woman whose voice could summon a king from his mountain, and she was in more danger than she had ever been in her life. The walk back to the pack's clearing was a disorienting journey through a world that had been fundamentally altered. The very air felt different, thinner, charged with the lingering electricity of Rowan's presence. The scent of him, that impossible, intoxicating scent of winter frost and ancient pines, was a ghost clinging to the fibers of her tunic, a phantom warmth on the skin of her wrist. Marwen felt branded by it, marked by an encounter that no one else had witnessed but that had changed the landscape of her soul. She moved, like a sleepwalker, her feet finding the path by memory alone, while her mind replayed every word, every look, every searing moment of contact. "You smell of heather after a rainstorm." And sorrow. The words were a balm and a wound. For 5 years, she had believed she was a nullity, a blank space in a world defined by scent. To learn that he could not only perceive her but had a specific, poetic understanding of her essence was a revelation that shook the foundations of her misery. It did not erase the pain, but it gave it a name, a texture. It meant she was not nothing. To him, at least, she was something. As she neared the edge of the firelight, the familiar sounds and smells of the pack crashed over her, a crude and unwelcome intrusion. The boisterous laughter, the smell of spilled ale and scorched meat, felt alien now, like the clamor of a foreign country. She hesitated in the shadows, pulling her cloak tighter, a futile attempt to hide the king's scent, to shield the fragile, new reality blooming inside her. Her re-entry did not go unnoticed. Lyra, her eyes sharp and malicious, spotted her immediately. "Look what the moon dragged back," she called out, her voice dripping with scorn. Her mate, Torvin, let out a low, derisive chuckle. Marwen kept her head down, aiming for the anonymity of the darkened tents on the far side of the clearing. She just wanted to be alone, to crawl into her small sleeping pallet and try to make sense of the storm inside her. "Where have you been?" Blank scent. Torvin blocked her path, his bulk casting a long, intimidating shadow. He leaned in, sniffing the air around her theatrically. His face, usually set in a dull, brutish confidence, contorted in confusion. "What's that smell?" Marwen froze, her blood turning to ice. "He smells it. Gods, he smells it." Lyra moved to his side, her nose twitching. "It's odd," she admitted, her brow furrowed. "Like a storm, cold." She looked at Marwen, her suspicion a palpable force. "Who were keep you with?" "No one," Marwen said, her voice barely a whisper. She tried to step around them, but Torvin shifted, blocking her again. "Don't lie to us," he growled, his authority as lead beta puffing him up. "There's a scent on you. Something. Alpha." The way he said the word made it an accusation. In their small, isolated pack, the presence of a strange alpha was a threat, a challenge. Marwen's heart hammered against her ribs. Fear made her reckless. She lifted her chin, meeting Torvin's gaze for the first time all night. "I was alone," she said, her voice quiet but firm, imbued with a sliver of the steel she hadn't known she possessed until Rowan put it there. "Maybe you're just smelling the wind." Her defiance stunned them into a moment of silence. The blank scent Omega did not make eye contact. She did not talk back. Torvin's confusion curdled into anger. "You watch your tone, wolfless," he snarled, taking a threatening step forward. He raised a hand, as if to shove her. "That's enough, Torvin." The voice was old and cracked like dry leaves, but it cut through the tension with undeniable authority. Old Elspeth stood near the healer's tent, a bundle of herbs in her hand. Her face, a roadmap of wrinkles and deep-set wisdom, was fixed on them. Her pale, cloudy eyes seemed to see more than others. They were not on Torvin, but on Marwen. Torvin grunted, lowering his hand. Challenging the pack's healer was a line even he wouldn't cross. "She's got a strange scent on her," he muttered, trying to save face. And a mouth, suddenly. He and Lyra shot Marwen one last venomous glare before stalking back toward the fire. Elspeth beckoned with a gnarled finger. "Come, child. Let me see your wrist." Marwen's breath hitched. How could she have known? She walked toward the healer's tent. The scent of dried herbs and wood smoke, a comforting curtain against the hostility of the pack. Inside, the small space was cluttered but clean, with bundles of roots and flowers hanging from the ceiling and clay pots lining the shelves. A small fire pit in the center cast a warm, dancing glow on the hide walls. Elspeth gestured for her to sit on a low stool. "Let me see," she repeated, her voice gentle now. Hesitantly, Marwen extended her arm. A faint, purplish bruise was already forming on her wrist, where Rowan's iron grip had held her. But Elspeth didn't look at the bruise. Her cloudy eyes were focused on the skin itself, and her weathered face was tight with concentration. She didn't touch it, not at first. Instead, she held her own hand just above Marwen's skin, her palm hovering over the mark. "There's frost on this burn," the old woman murmured, more to herself than to Marwen. "An echo of cold power. This is no common alpha's mark." Marwen said nothing, her throat too tight to form words. Elspeth finally took her wrist, her touch surprisingly soft. Her thumb traced the edges of the bruise. "He was here," she stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "The king." The name hung in the warm, herb-scented air. Marwen could only nod, a single, jerky movement. Tears she had refused to shed on the outcrop now pricked at her eyes. "I thought as much," Elspeth sighed, a long, weary sound. "When the forest went silent as a grave, I knew. Only he can command that kind of stillness." She released Marwen's wrist and began grinding something in a small stone bowl, a pungent, green paste. This was always going to happen. Some bonds are woven too deeply into the fabric of the world to be unmade by shifter magic. "He said it was silenced," Marwen whispered, finding her voice. "Not severed. He said my song woke it up." Elspeth paused her grinding, looking at Marwen with a sharp, piercing gaze. "He told you that? Good. The truth is a bitter root, but it is better than the sweet poison of a lie." She scooped the paste from the bowl and gently began to apply it to Marwen's bruise. The poultice was cool and soothing against her hot skin. Silenced bonds are old magic, dangerous magic. They don't destroy the connection, they starve it. They wall it off, build a dam of spells and will to hold back the river. But the river is still there, waiting. And a song like yours, child, a song born of that much pain and longing, from the very source of the bond itself, that is not a song. That is a key. Marwen watched the healer's deft hands. "He said I was feeding a starving thing. He commanded me to stop." "Of course he did," Elspeth said, wrapping a clean linen strip around the poultice. "He is a king, and he is a fool. He thinks he can command the tides. He broke you to protect you, and now he would see you silenced to protect his own peace. He is afraid, Marwen. Not of his enemies, but of this. Of you." The idea of Rowan, the indomitable, scarred king, being afraid of her was so preposterous that she almost laughed. "Afraid of what? I'm an Omega. I have no wolf, no status, No power. No power? Elspeth tied off the bandage and finally met her eyes, a flicker of something ancient and knowing in their depths. You have the only power that has ever brought a king to his knees, his own heart. You are his mate. Not was. Are. That mark on his hand that you saw glowing? It has never faded. It has been there all this time. A cold brand over his heart, reminding him every day of what he threw away. Marwen's breath shuddered out of her. He had carried that mark for 5 years, a secret sigil of his sacrifice. The thought was a fresh agony. A silenced bond is not a dead bond, Elspeth continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It is a hungry one. It will lie dormant for years, but when it wakes, its hunger is ravenous. It will not be content with echoes and songs. It will demand to be made whole. She leaned closer, her expression deadly serious. You have a choice to make, child. You can obey your king. You can lock that beautiful, sorrowful voice away and live out your days here, as the blank scent, safe in your misery. Or, you can sing. He said they would find me, Marwen whispered, the threat echoing in her ears. His enemies. They will, Elspeth agreed, her tone grim. The moment his scent lingers too long in this valley, they will come sniffing. Your song is a beacon, and it calls not only to the wolf who loves you, but to the wolves who hunt him. To sing is to declare war. The healer rose and walked to a small, carved wooden chest in the corner of the tent. She opened it and removed a small, smooth gray stone, so dark it was almost black. She pressed it into Marwen's free hand. It was cold to the touch. What is this? Marwen asked, looking at the stone. A whisper stone. From the old magic. It will not hide you, but it will cloud your scent from those who are not actively seeking you. It may buy you a little time. Elspeth closed Marwen's fingers around the stone. The choice is yours. A quiet life of shame, or a dangerous life of purpose. But do not choose out of fear of him, or for him. Choose for yourself. Choose what you can live with. Marwen looked from the stone in her hand to the bandage on her wrist. The scent of Elspeth's poultice mingled with the faint, fading scent of Rowan's presence. Heather and rain, sorrow and frost. For the first time, she felt the stirrings of something other than despair. It was a terrifying, exhilarating flicker of agency. Her voice was not just a lament, it was a power. Her bond was not just a wound, it was a tether. She left the healer's tent and walked not to her own sleeping place, but back toward the path that led to the moonlit outcrop. The bonfire was dying now, and most of the pack had stumbled off to their beds. The night was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. She reached the edge of the forest and turned to look back at the sleeping camp, at the place that had been her prison for 5 long years. Then she looked north, toward the jagged, unseen peaks of his kingdom. The choice, Elspeth had said. A quiet life, or a war. Clutching the cold whisper stone in her hand, Marwen faced the mountains. She didn't sing. Not yet. But as the last embers of the pack's fire faded into the darkness, she opened her mouth and let a single, perfect note escape into the night. It wasn't a lament. It was a promise. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that miles away, a king's wolf had just lifted its head. The day after Rowan's visit, the world seemed to hold its breath. A fragile, crystalline tension settled over the Black Creek pack, and Marwen felt it in the marrow of her bones. The whisper stone Elspeth had given her was a cold, smooth weight in the pocket of her tunic, a constant reminder of the choice she had made with that single defiant note. She went about her duties mending fishing nets down by the creek, her fingers clumsy and numb with a new and terrifying awareness. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little too long. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. The forest was no longer her sanctuary. It was a listening ear. She was not the only one who felt the change. Alpha Borin had doubled the patrols along the territory's edge. The pack's best hunters, grim-faced and armed, moved like ghosts through the trees. A nervous energy thrummed beneath the surface of the camp's daily life. Tempers were short. Fights broke out over trivial matters. The pack felt the presence of a powerful outsider in their woods, a lingering scent of ozone and frost that their alpha could not identify and therefore could not dismiss. Marwen became the focal point of that anxiety. The shifters avoided her, their glances a mixture of scorn and a new, wary suspicion. Torvin and Lyra were the worst. They watched her constantly, their eyes narrowed, as if trying to decipher a puzzle that infuriated them. "She's been talking to herself," Lyra hissed to a group of she-wolves as Marwen passed, her voice a stage whisper designed to carry. Down by the water, singing her little freakish songs. It's unnatural, another agreed. For a wolfless to be so. Calm, after the alpha put her in her place. Calm was the last thing Marwen felt. Inside, she was a maelstrom of fear and a strange, wild hope. The bond, now that it was awake, was a constant, low hum beneath her skin. It was no longer a phantom limb but a living nerve, and it tied her to the distant, invisible presence of its other half. Sometimes, a wave of profound loneliness that was not her own would wash over her. Other times, she felt a flash of cold, hard fury that made her own hands clench into fists. She was feeling the echoes of a king. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the western peaks, bathing the valley in hues of orange and purple, Alpha Borin cornered her. He appeared before her as she was stacking firewood, his large frame blocking out the light. "You," he grunted, his voice low and dangerous. He leaned in and sniffed the air around her, his nostrils flaring. The faint scent of rowan, which she imagined she had washed away, still clung to her like a second skin, perceptible only to the most powerful of noses. Borin's eyes narrowed. "There is a wrongness about you, girl, more than usual. A strange scent has been on our borders since the full moon. The guards say it's like nothing they know, but it reeks of power, of challenge." Marwen kept her gaze fixed on the woodpile, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. "You will tell me if you have seen anyone," he commanded. "If you have spoken to any stranger. If you bring trouble to this pack, Marwen Kaldis, your wolfless state will be the least of your worries. I will cast you out into the wilds myself. Do you understand me?" "I understand," she whispered, the words tasting of ash. He stared at her for a long moment, his displeasure a palpable force, before turning and stalking away. The threat was clear. She was balanced on a knife's edge, not just from Rowan's distant enemies, but from the very people she was forced to call her own. An hour later, the summons came. Not a call or a shout, but a sudden, chilling silence that fell over the entire clearing. The casual chatter died. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer ceased. Every wolf, man, woman, and child froze, their heads snapping toward the northern entrance to the camp. A man was walking toward them. He moved with an unhurried, predatory grace that was utterly alien to the rough-and-tumble swagger of the Black Creek shifters. He was tall and lean, wrapped in dark, hardened leathers and gray furs that seemed to absorb the fading light. A heavy sword was strapped to his back, its pommel a grim, unadorned wolf's head. His hair was the color of winter wheat, braided tightly with leather cords, and his face was a tapestry of hard angles and stark control. But it was his scent that stopped every heart. It was the scent of the north of cold steel, mountain wind, and the disciplined fury of a wolf sworn to a king. It was an extension of Rowan's own scent, but without the frost and sorrow. This was purely the scent of the blade. He walked into the center of their clearing as if it were his own throne room, his pale, ice-blue eyes sweeping over the assembled pack with cold indifference. He was a lone wolf, surrounded by dozens of hostile shifters, and he looked utterly unimpressed. Alpha Borin moved to intercept him, his own considerable bulk seeming diminished in the stranger's presence. He puffed out his chest, a low growl rumbling in his throat. "You are on Black Creek land, stranger. You are not welcome here. State your name and your purpose." The man's gaze flickered to Borin, dismissing him in an instant. His eyes continued their sweep of the crowd, cold and methodical, until they found her. They locked onto Marwen, and in that moment, she knew. This was not a random intruder. This was a message. "My name is Kalen," the warrior said, his voice as sharp and cold as his scent. He did not look at Borin as he spoke, keeping his piercing gaze fixed on Marwen. "I am the first blade of the Winterfang clan. I carry a message from my Alpha King." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The Alpha King. Whispers erupted like wildfire. Every head turned from the imposing warrior to the small, silent Omega standing by the woodpile. Marwen felt the heat of 100 pairs of eyes on her, a physical weight of disbelief and accusation. Torvin and Lyra were staring, their mouths agape, their earlier scorn replaced by stunned confusion. Kalen took a deliberate step toward her, and then another. The Black Creek wolves instinctively parted before him, a sea of bodies making way for the king's instrument. He stopped a dozen feet from her, his posture radiating a lethal stillness. "Marwen Kaldis," he said, his voice ringing with absolute authority in the silent clearing. The public use of her full name was a branding, He was marking her in front of her entire pack. King Roan Halvik has felt your disturbance. He wishes you to know that the sleeping dead are best left to lie. Your song is a danger not only to yourself but to the peace he has fought to maintain. He commands you to cease. The words were a hammer blow, each one driving the nail of her shame deeper. He was reprimanding her, chastising her like a child, using his warrior as a proxy to deliver a public humiliation far worse than any Lyra could devise. Her connection to the great Alpha King was not a secret treasure. It was a crime he was exposing to the world. This is your only warning, Kaelin finished, his voice dropping, though it still carried to every corner of the clearing. Defy him again, and the consequences will be severe. Silence. The entire pack was staring at her, their expressions a kaleidoscope of shock, fear, and a dawning, greedy curiosity. She was no longer just the blank scent. She was the woman who had disturbed the Alpha King. Kaelin stood for a moment longer, letting the weight of his message sink in, letting the pack recalibrate their understanding of the wolfless Omega in their midst. Then, he turned to leave. But he paused. With a movement so slight no one else would have noticed, he inclined his head, signaling for her to follow him to the edge of the clearing. It wasn't a request. Her feet felt like lead, but she obeyed, moving away from the pack's accusing stares. She followed him into the deepening twilight beneath the eaves of the forest. Away from prying eyes and ears, he turned to face her. Up close, he was even more intimidating. A fresh scar, pale and thin, crossed his lip. His ice-blue eyes were ancient, the eyes of a wolf who had seen 100 battles. "The king's message is delivered," he said, his voice a low, confidential murmur now. "Mine is a warning." "I don't understand," she whispered, her throat dry. "You are playing with the threads of fate, girl," he said, his tone harsh, but lacking the cruel theater of his public address. "The king, he is not the man you remember. He carries a kingdom on his back. He has held the peace for 5 years through blood and iron and a will that would break lesser alphas. This bond you have reawakened. It is a crack in his armor. It distracts him. It weakens him. His enemies are like jackals. They will smell that weakness from 100 miles away." "He sent you to threaten me," she said, a spark of her earlier defiance returning. A flicker of something, was it pity? Respect? And passed through his cold eyes. "He sent me to frighten you into staying alive," Kaelin corrected her. "He knows your stubbornness. He knew a quiet word would not be enough." He reached into a pouch at his belt and pressed a small, heavy object into her hand. It was a silver locket, tarnished with age, on a simple leather cord. It was cold from the northern air. He wanted you to have this, to remember the price of his silence. Marwen's trembling fingers fumbled with the clasp. She opened it. Inside were 2 miniature portraits, painted with exquisite detail. On one side was a young man with stormy hair and amber eyes full of fire and hope Rowan, before the crown and the scars had hardened him. On the other was a girl with dark hair and a smile that reached her eyes, a girl who believed in promises, whose scent was of heather and rain and nothing of sorrow. It was her, a version of her she no longer recognized. A tear escaped and slid down her cheek. "Why?" she choked out. Kaelin's gaze softened almost imperceptibly. "Because he is a king who remembers he was once a man, and that man made a vow to a girl he loved. Every part of him screams to honor it. Every part of his duty forces him to break it. You are the war inside of him." He looked back toward the pack, then leaned in closer, his next words a razor's edge whisper for her alone. "He also said to tell you." The warrior breathed, the words a devastating confidence. "Do not make me choose between my kingdom and your ghost." The world tilted on its axis. It wasn't just a threat. It was a plea, a confession, a declaration that if she forced his hand, he would choose his duty, and it would destroy him. He was asking her, begging her, to let him go, to let her go, to let the ghost of what they were finally find its grave. Kaelin straightened up, his face once again an impassive mask. Without another word, he turned and melted back into the forest, as silent and deadly as he had arrived. Marwen stood alone in the darkness, the silver locket, a block of ice in her palm, his final, whispered words echoing in the ruins of her heart. The locket felt heavier than a stone, a cold anchor pulling Marwen down into a sea of memory and impossible choices. She stood in the deepening twilight, the world muted and gray, clutching the silver circle so tightly its edges dug into her palm. "Do not make me choose between my kingdom and your ghost." It wasn't just a warning, It was the raw, bleeding heart of his torment, laid bare for her to see. He had sent his first blade not only to threaten her into silence, but to show her the profound cost of her song. Each note was another crack in the dam of his resolve. Returning to the clearing was like walking into a cage of wolves that had just been shown a piece of fresh meat. The pack's energy had shifted from fearful suspicion to a sharp, predatory interest. She was no longer Marwyn the blank scent, the pack pariah. She was Marwyn Caldis, the Omega, who could summon the attention of the Alpha King. She was a curiosity, a potential pawn, a source of power to be deciphered and, perhaps, exploited. Alpha Borin was the first to approach, his demeanor a stark contrast to his earlier threats. He intercepted her near the fire, his face a mask of false cordiality. "Marwyn," he said, using her name with a respect she had never heard from him. "The king's warrior, he spoke to you." It was a statement, demanding a response. "He did," she confirmed, her voice flat. She kept the locket hidden in her clenched fist. "And what business does the Alpha King have with an Omega of my pack?" Borin pressed, his eyes glinting with a greedy light. The implication was clear. My pack, my Omega, my business. The lie came to her lips, smooth and practiced from years of self-preservation. "My grandmother served his mother. Long ago. It was a family matter, a message of condolence for her passing years back, long delayed. It was a weak, flimsy story, but it was all she could offer." Borin grunted, clearly not believing a word of it, but her newfound connection to a higher power made him cautious. He couldn't simply beat the truth out of her, not anymore. "See that you cause no further trouble," he warned, though the threat lacked its earlier conviction. He was reassessing her value, and the thought made her skin crawl. For the rest of the evening, she felt the pack's eyes on her. They watched her every move. Whispers followed in her wake. Lyra and Torvin kept their distance, their usual scorn replaced by a resentful, confused silence. She had become something they couldn't understand, and it frightened them. That night, sleep offered no escape. She lay on her thin pallet, the cold silver locket pressed against her sternum, a constant, chilling reminder. His plea warred with her own desperate need. To be silent was to accept her fate as a ghost, to fade into the gray background of the Black Creek pack until she was nothing but a forgotten story. To sing was to risk his kingdom, to become the very weakness his enemies sought, to potentially cause the death of the man she still, in the deepest, most secret part of her soul, loved. The bond hummed, a low, sorrowful thrum against her ribs. It fed her images, fragments of his life. She saw a map spread on a heavy oak table, his scarred hands tracing lines of conflict. She smelled the cloying scent of political intrigue in a crowded hall. She felt a bone-deep weariness, the weight of a crown that was both a burden and a duty. The war was not just inside him. It was now inside her, too. Days turned into a week. Marwyn fell into a state of hollow compliance. She did her chores. She kept her head down. She did not sing. She did not even hum. The silence she imposed on herself was a suffocating shroud, far worse than the one he had forced upon her. This was a silence of her own choosing, born of fear and a desperate, misguided love. And the bond began to starve. The vibrant hum beneath her skin faded to a weak, erratic pulse. The flashes of his emotions grew faint, then disappeared altogether. The scent of him that had clung to her began to dissipate, leaving behind the familiar, dreadful emptiness. She was erasing him. She was erasing herself. Her spirit began to wither. The light in her eyes dimmed. The small measure of strength she had found on the outcrop crumbled into dust. She was becoming a ghost again, and this time it was by her own hand. One evening, Elspeth found her sitting by the creek, staring blankly at the rushing water. The old healer sat beside her on the damp stones, the silence between them comfortable and deep. "The whisper stone feels cold in your pocket," Elspeth said finally, her voice gentle. "It has no voice to cloud." Marwyn didn't look at her. "It is what he wanted. He is a king who believes he can command the sunrise," Elspeth said, repeating her earlier words. "That does not mean the sun must obey. A wolf cannot live without its howl, child. A heart cannot live without its song. You are dying from the inside out." "I am protecting him," Marwyn whispered, the words tasting like a lie even to her. "Are you?" the healer challenged softly. "Or are you protecting yourself from a life that might demand courage? You say you do this for him, but what of the bond? It is a living thing, a third soul woven between the two of you. By starving it, you are not just silencing yourself. You are weakening him in a way no enemy blade ever could. You are severing the anchor of his soul." Elspeth placed a gnarled hand on Marwen's arm. "He asked you not to make him choose. He did not ask you to kill the best part of yourself." Elspeth's words were a seed of doubt planted in the barren ground of her resolve. Over the next 2 days, it grew, watered by the profound and growing emptiness inside her. She felt the bond's absence like a physical amputation. Was this truly saving him? This slow, mutual death of the spirit? Or was it the ultimate act of surrender, not just to Rowan's command, but to the scorn of the world that had always told her she was nothing? The decision came on the 3rd night. A storm was rolling in from the north, from his mountains. The wind howled through the valley, carrying the scent of rain and distant lightning. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy and oppressive. The pack huddled in this main lodge, seeking warmth and shelter from the coming gale. But Marwen felt a different call. The storm was a reflection of the tempest inside her. The howling wind was the scream trapped in her own throat. She slipped out of the lodge, unnoticed in the commotion, and pulled her thin cloak tight against the whipping wind. She didn't walk to her usual outcrop. She walked toward the heart of the territory, to a high, windswept hill known as the Elderstone, where the pack's alphas had made their most sacred vows for generations. Rain began to fall, cold and hard, plastering her hair to her face and soaking her tunic. Lightning spiderwebbed across the sky, illuminating the valley in brief, stark flashes. Thunder cracked overhead, a deep, guttural roar that shook the very ground beneath her feet. This was a night of power, a night of reckoning. She reached the summit of the hill. At its center was the Elderstone, a massive, flat-topped boulder scarred with the runes of ancient oaths. The wind was a physical force here, trying to tear her from her feet. The rain was a torrential downpour. She was a small, fragile figure against the raw, elemental fury of the storm. She took the locket from around her neck and opened it, looking at the faces of the boy and girl who had believed in forever. Then she closed it, a final, decisive click. She would not be his ghost. She would not let him be ruled by one. A bond was not a weakness. It was a strength, the greatest strength their kind possessed. It was his duty to his kingdom that was the cage, and she would no longer help him lock the door. She lifted her face to the storm, the rain washing away the tears she didn't realize she was shedding. She opened her mouth, and she sang. It was not the soft, sorrowful lament of the full moon. This was a song forged in the heart of the storm. Her voice rose, no longer fractured and hesitant, but clear and powerful, a silver thread of defiance against the thunder's roar. It was a song of challenge, of reclamation. She sang of a bond not broken but betrayed. She sang of a king hiding behind a crown and a girl who would no longer be a ghost. She poured all her pain, her anger, her love, and her desperate, unyielding hope into the melody. Her voice soared, weaving through the wind and the rain, a living current of magic and will. It was no longer a key. It was a battering ram, aimed at the walls he had built around his heart, and the world answered. The bond didn't just hum, it exploded. It roared to life like a flash flood, a tidal wave of sensation that slammed into her, buckling her knees. She felt him, not an echo, but his immediate, overwhelming presence. She felt his shock, a jolt as if he'd been struck by the lightning that lit the sky. It was followed by a wave of pure, undiluted fury, a rage so profound it was almost a physical blow. Then, beneath the rage, came the agony. The sound of her song was a torment to him, the sweetest torture, the breaking of his iron will. She sang on, her voice rising higher, pushing against his anger, calling to the wolf beneath the king. I am here. I am not a memory. I am real. A bolt of lightning struck a massive pine tree on a nearby ridge, and in the blinding white flash, she saw him. He was not on the hill with her, but he was there, a shadow, an apparition formed of mist and moonlight and pure alpha power, standing 100 feet away. It was his wolf, a great, spectral beast the size of a pony, its fur the color of a snow-covered mountain, its eyes 2 burning amber coals. It was a projection of his will, his spirit, sent across the miles by the raw power of their reawakened bond. The wolf lowered its head, and a howl tore through the storm, a sound not of aggression, but of soul-deep anguish and yearning. The apparition dissolved as quickly as it had appeared, but the impact remained. He was coming. She had sung, and he was coming. Not his warrior, not his shadow. Him. And he was furious. Her song faltered, her voice finally breaking. She sank to her knees on the wet earth before the elder stone, trembling and utterly spent. The storm raged around her, but inside, a terrifying calm had settled. She had made her choice. She had declared her war. Now, she would face the king. The rain-soaked earth leached the warmth from Marwen's body, but a different kind of fire burned within her. She knelt before the elder stone, the storm her only witness, her song a lingering echo in the gale, the spectral image of Rowan's wolf, the anguish in its howl, the burning amber of its eyes was seared into her mind. She had thrown a stone into a silent, deep lake, and now the tsunami was racing toward her shore. There was no taking it back. There was only the waiting. Getting to her feet was an act of will. Her limbs were heavy, her muscles shaking from the volatile cocktail of adrenaline and magical backlash. The journey back to the pack's lodge was a blur of whipping branches, slick mud, and the relentless, driving rain. She slipped through the flap of the main lodge, a drenched and shivering wraith. A few heads turned, their expressions annoyed at the gust of wind and rain she let in, but no one paid her any real mind. She was, for a moment, invisible again, and she clung to the anonymity like a shield. She found her small, dry corner, stripped off her soaking cloak, and wrapped herself in a coarse wool blanket. Her body trembled, but not from the cold. It was the vibration of the bond, now a roaring, thrumming conduit between her and the approaching king. It was no longer a gentle hum. It was a high-tension wire, singing with raw, uncontrolled power. She could feel his approach with every beat of her heart. He was moving fast, a storm of fury crossing the territories, his singular focus aimed at her like an arrow. Hours passed. The storm outside began to relent, the thunder retreating into a distant grumble, the rain softening to a persistent drizzle. Inside the lodge, the pack settled into a restless sleep, their snores and murmurs a mundane counterpoint to the epic drama unfolding in Marwen's soul. She did not sleep. She sat upright, her back against the rough-hewn wall, and waited for the dawn, and for him. He arrived just as the first gray, watery light of morning began to filter through the cracks in the lodge walls. There was no warning, no call from the sentries. One moment, the clearing was empty, save for the dripping rain. The next, he was there. He stood in the center of the camp, a solitary, immovable figure carved from winter and wrath. He was not cloaked in the furs of a king, but dressed for war, in black, hardened leather armor that seemed to drink the morning mist. Rainwater slicked his dark hair to his skull and dripped from the harsh planes of his face. He was soaked, mud-splattered, and looked as if he had run the entire distance from his mountain keep. His scent hit the camp first, a wave of ozone, wet earth, and pure, undiluted, alpha rage that was a physical blow. It was the scent of a predator that had been denied its kill for too long. The pack woke instantly. Shifters bolted upright from their sleeping pallets, the fur on their necks bristling, low growls rumbling in their chests. They smelled the intruder, the overwhelming power, the sheer, murderous intent. In seconds, the lodge was a scene of controlled chaos as warriors grabbed for axes and knives, their wolves rising to the surface, ready to defend their territory. Alpha Borin was the first one out of the lodge, shirtless and armed with a heavy wood axe, his face a mask of aggression. He took one look at the lone figure standing in the heart of his territory, sniffed the air, and froze. The axe in his hand suddenly seemed like a child's toy. The blood drained from his face. "King Rowan," he breathed, the name a croak of disbelief and terror. The rest of the pack spilled out behind him, their aggressive postures faltering as they recognized the legendary scarred face of the Alpha King. They had heard the stories, the whispers of his brutality in battle, his iron will. Seeing him in the flesh, radiating a power that made the air itself tremble, was another thing entirely. The Black Creek warriors, so proud and boisterous, shuffled their feet, their eyes wide with a primal fear they had not felt in years. Rowan's gaze was not on them. It was locked on the entrance to the lodge, a burning, amber stare that cut through the crowd and pinned Marwen where she stood. He saw her, and the rage in his eyes intensified. A contained inferno. He took a single, deliberate step forward. "Marwen Caldis," he called out, his voice a low, lethal rumble that carried across the entire clearing. It was not a greeting, it was a summons. "Come here, now." Every head swiveled to look at her. The pack stared, their minds reeling, trying to connect the wolfless, scentless Omega they had tormented for years with the incandescent fury of the most powerful alpha in the known lands. Lyra's face was a pale mask of shock. Torvin looked as if he'd been poleaxed. Marwen's heart was a frantic drum, but her fear was overlaid with a strange, terrible clarity. This was it, the moment of reckoning. She pushed the blanket from her shoulders and walked out of the lodge, her head held high. She moved through the parted sea of her packmates, their stunned silence a deafening roar in her ears. She felt like a sacrificial offering walking toward the altar. The drizzle had slicked her hair and dampened her simple tunic, but she did not shiver. She stopped 10 feet from him, the space between them crackling with unspoken history and raw, volatile energy. Up close, his fury was a physical heat that washed over her. The lines of his face were etched with exhaustion and a pain so deep it was terrifying. "What?" he began, his voice dangerously soft, each word a precisely chipped piece of ice. "Did you think you were doing?" "I was answering you," she replied, her own voice quiet but steady. She would not be cowed. "Not now." His lips twisted into a humorless snarl. "Answering me? You were screaming, woman. You sang a hymn of rebellion that shook the foundations of my keep. You think this is a game? You think you can call and I will simply come, a dog to his master's whistle? No," she said, shaking her head. "I think you are a wolf who has forgotten his own howl. You hide in your castle and call it duty. You sever your own heart and call it sacrifice. I sang to remind you that some things can't be buried." His control snapped. With a speed that was preternatural, he closed the distance between them. His hand shot out and clamped around her upper arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. He yanked her forward until her face was inches from his. The raw power coming off him was dizzying. His amber eyes were blazing, the wolf so close to the surface it was all she could see. "You know nothing of my duties," he snarled, his hot breath washing over her face. "You know nothing of the blood I have spilled to keep the peace, the compromises I have made, the parts of my own soul I have cut away to protect thousands of lives, including yours." Alpha Borin, seeing his Omega physically accosted, finally found a shred of his courage. It was pack law. He took a hesitant step forward. "King Rowan, she is of my pack. You will not harm." Rowan did not even look at him. He let out a low, guttural growl, a sound of pure, primal dominance that vibrated through the very air. It was not a challenge. It was a statement of absolute authority. Borin and every other wolf in the clearing flinched back as if struck. Their wolves, faced with a power so far beyond their own, whimpered and submitted, forcing their human counterparts to lower their eyes, to bow their heads. In an instant, he had brought the entire Black Creek pack to its knees without laying a hand on them. All except one. Marwen did not look away. She met his furious gaze, her own eyes filled with a defiant pain. "And what about my life?" she demanded, her voice trembling but unbroken. "The one you left in pieces? Am I just a line item in the budget of your kingdom's security? A necessary sacrifice you can forget about?" His grip on her arm tightened, his knuckles white. The fury in his eyes warred with something else, something that looked devastatingly like heartbreak. "Forget you?" he rasped, his voice cracking with a raw emotion he could no longer contain. "Gods, woman, I have done nothing but remember you. Every sunrise is a reminder of the one I can't share with you. Every full moon is a torment. You are the ghost that haunts my every waking moment and my every dream. Your silence was the only thing that made it bearable." His confession, ripped from him in the heat of his anger, struck her more deeply than any physical blow. The rage that had sustained her faltered, replaced by a wave of shared, soul-crushing sorrow. The bond between them flared, a burning hymn of mutual agony. He seemed to realize what he had said, the vulnerability he had exposed. He released her arm as if it had burned him. Taking a step back, he ran a hand over his face, a gesture of profound weariness. The Alpha King, the great warrior, looked lost. "What do you want from me, Marwen?" he asked, his voice now ragged with exhaustion. "Why would you do this? Why force this confrontation?" "I want you to stop lying," she said, her voice soft but fierce. "To yourself, to me. This bond is not a weakness. It's who we are. Hiding from it, starving it, that is what weakens us. Your enemies will sense the conflict in you, the war in your soul, far faster than they will ever sense this." She gestured to the space between them, to the shimmering, invisible tether that connected their hearts. He stared at her, the anger draining from him, replaced by a vast, desolate emptiness. The entire pack remained silent, unwilling and unable to move, held captive by the raw, emotional power of the scene unfolding before them. Suddenly, a piercing shriek cut through the tense quiet. It came from the edge of the clearing. A young shifter, one of the sentries, stumbled into view, his eyes wide with terror. He had an arrow sprouting from his shoulder, its black fletching a stark contrast to the crimson blooming on his tunic. "Hunters!" he gasped, before collapsing to the muddy ground. "They're coming from the south ridge, dozens of them." Rowan's head snapped up. His weariness vanished, instantly replaced by the sharp, lethal focus of a king at war. His eyes met Marwen's, and in them, she saw a new and terrible emotion: regret. His greatest fear had just come true. The jackals had smelled the weakness, the distraction. Her song had not just summoned the king, it had summoned his enemies right to her doorstep. Chaos erupted. The primal fear that had paralyzed the Black Creek pack was instantly incinerated by the immediate, tangible threat of hunters. A shifter's hatred for the human hunters, who saw them as beasts to be exterminated, was a deep, cellular instinct. Growls turned to war cries. Alpha Borin, his face grim, bellowed orders, his fear of Rowan eclipsed by his duty to his pack. Warriors scrambled for weapons, forming a ragged defensive line, their bodies tense and ready to shift. Rowan was a vortex of calm in the heart of the storm. The conflict, the anguish, the emotional turmoil, all of it vanished, locked away behind the cold, pragmatic eyes of a seasoned commander. His gaze swept the southern ridge, assessing the terrain, the angles of attack, the pathetic inadequacy of the camp's defenses. He turned, not to Borin, but to Marwen. His voice was devoid of all emotion, sharp and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. "How many fighting-fit wolves does Borin have?" The question was so unexpected, so direct, that it took her a second to process. He was including her. He was speaking to her as a strategist, not a problem. 30, she answered, her mind racing. "Maybe 35, if you count the older ones. They are strong, but not disciplined. They've not seen a real fight in a generation." He nodded, a curt, sharp gesture. "They'll be a distraction at best." His eyes met hers, and the message was brutally clear. This is on us. The bond, which had moments before been a conduit for their pain, now transmitted a different current, a shared, focused intensity, a grim understanding of the stakes. The world narrowed to this single moment, this single threat. Without another word to her, he turned to face the terrified pack. "Alpha Borin," he roared, and his voice was the crack of a whip, cutting through the panicked shouts. Every wolf froze, turning to him. "Your warriors will hold the line at the creek bed. Do not let them cross the water. Do not let them break your formation. Do not pursue. Your only objective is to hold them." "Am I understood?" Borin, faced with an enemy he understood far, better than a tormented king, found his footing. He nodded, his jaw set. "And you?" "I will be the hunter," Rowan said, his voice dropping to a lethal growl. A faint, golden light began to glow in his eyes. He looked back at Marwen one last time. "Stay in the lodge. Stay out of sight." It was an order born not of anger, but of a desperate, protective instinct. Then he moved. He didn't run. He flowed, a black-clad shadow streaking toward the southern edge of the clearing, pulling two short, wicked-looking blades from sheaths at the small of his back. Marwen watched him go, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. "This is my fault, my song, my rebellion, my war." The guilt was a physical sickness. She couldn't just hide. She couldn't be the damsel cowering in the lodge while he fought a battle she had started. She turned and ran, not to the main lodge, but to Elspeth's tent. The old healer was already at work, laying out bandages, salves, and sharp, clean knives on a hide cloth. She looked up as Marwen burst in, her cloudy eyes calm and knowing. "What can I do?" Marwen asked, her voice breathless. "What you have always done," Elspeth replied, her hands never ceasing their methodical work. "You can be their heart when the fighting is done. For now, help me tear these linens. There will be many wounds." The sounds of battle erupted from the ridge, the brutal metallic clang of steel, the guttural roars of shifting wolves, and the sharp, venomous twang of crossbows. Marwen's hands trembled as she tore strips of cloth, each sound from outside a fresh torment. She could feel Rowan through the bond, a blazing inferno of controlled violence. It wasn't the hot, chaotic rage of a berserker. It was the cold, focused fury of an executioner. She felt the impact of every blow he landed, the jarring shock of a parry, the white-hot flash of his pain as a silver-tipped bolt grazed his side. The sensation was so real, so vivid, that she cried out, clutching her own side, a phantom wound blooming there. Elspeth's hand steadied her. Breathe, child. Do not let his battle become yours. Anchor yourself, or his pain will drown you. Marwen forced herself to breathe, to push back against the overwhelming flood of sensation. She focused on the task at hand, the simple, tearing motion, grounding herself in the physical world. The tide of battle ebbed and flowed. The Black Creek warriors were holding the line, their furious howls a testament to their bravery, but they were taking casualties. She could hear the pained yelps, the cries of the wounded. Then, a new sound cut through the din, a hunting horn, its call high and triumphant, and a new scent on the wind, carried by the damp air acrid smoke. "They're trying to flush us out," Elspeth murmured, her face grim as she sniffed the air. "They've set fire to the western woods." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Marwen's focus. The main lodge was wood and hide. The tents, the supplies, everything would go up in flames. The pack would be caught between the hunter's blades and the fire. She ran to the flap of the tent and looked out. Thick, black smoke was already billowing over the treetops, casting a suffocating pall over the clearing. Sparks drifted on the wind like malevolent fireflies. The defensive line at the creek bed began to waver. The wolves looked from the fire at their backs to the hunters at their front, their discipline crumbling in the face of two threats. Through the bond, she felt Rowan's attention shift. He felt the fire, the pack's wavering morale. He was one wolf, one king, trying to hold back an entire tide of death. He was stretched too thin. He was going to be overwhelmed. In that moment, Elspeth's words came back to her. A wolf cannot live without its howl. A heart cannot live without its song. She had sung for rebellion. She had sung for remembrance. Now, she had to sing for them. Marwen ran from the healer's tent, out into the smoky, chaotic clearing. She scrambled onto the great, flat top of the Elderstone, the very place where she had issued her challenge. Now, it would be her stage. She stood there, a small, defiant figure, against a backdrop of smoke and war, and she took a deep, shuddering breath. She closed her eyes, shutting out the chaos, and reached for the bond. She didn't push against his pain or his rage. She wrapped her own strength around it, a silent, spiritual reinforcement. "I am here. I am with you." She felt a flicker of surprise from him, a brief, questioning touch across their connection, before his focus returned to the fight. Then, she sang. There was no storm this time. There was only the fire and the clash of steel. Her voice rose above it all, not a challenge or a lament, but a hymn. It was a song of the pack, ancient and deep, a melody that every shifter knew in their blood and bones. It was the song of the great hunt, of the strength of the many, of the courage of the lone wolf defending its own. Her voice, clear and pure, soared over the battlefield, infused with the magic of the bond, with the undeniable authority of an alpha's mate. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The wavering Black Creek warriors heard the song, and it was like a draft of pure courage. Their heads came up, their spines straightened. The fear in their eyes was replaced by a renewed, burning fury. They turned back to the creek bed, their howls answering her song, and they pushed the line of hunters back with a ferocity they hadn't known they possessed. The hunters heard it too. The song unsettled them, an eerie, supernatural sound that cut through their battle lust and planted a seed of cold dread in their hearts. It was a sound that spoke of a magic they did not understand, a power their silver blades could not touch, and Rowan felt it. He felt her song not just in his ears, but in his very soul. It was a current of pure strength, a river of power pouring directly into him. The phantom pain in his side lessened. The weariness in his muscles abated. He felt her belief, her courage, her unwavering presence, and it fueled him. His movements became faster, deadlier. The two short blades in his hands became a blur of silver, a whirlwind of destruction that cut a swath through the enemy ranks. Marwen sang, pouring every ounce of herself into the melody. Her song was the rhythm of the battle, the heartbeat of the pack. She directed them, encouraged them, shielded them with her voice. The smoke stung her eyes, the ash coated her tongue, but she did not stop. This was her fight, her purpose. She was not a wolfless omega. She was the heart of the pack, and her voice was its roar. The tide of the battle turned. The hunters, unnerved by the song and decimated by Rowan's relentless assault, broke and fled. Their retreat was a chaotic, panicked scramble back over the southern ridge. The Black Creek wolves, howling in triumph, started to give chase. "Hold!" Rowan's voice bellowed, cutting through their victory cries. "Let them run! See to the fire and the wounded! The fight was over. Silence descended, broken only by the crackle of the approaching fire and the groans of the injured. Marwen's song faded into the smoky air, her voice finally giving out. She swayed on top of the elder stone, utterly drained, her throat raw. She saw him then, walking back toward the clearing from the creek bed. He was covered in mud and blood, some his, most not. He moved with a weary stiffness, a deep gash bleeding freely on his left forearm, but his eyes were on her. He walked through the chaos, past the wounded wolves and the celebrating warriors, his gaze never leaving hers. He stopped at the base of the elder stone and looked up at her. The fury was gone. The anguish was gone. In their place was a look of raw, staggering awe. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He simply raised his uninjured hand, his palm open in a clear, silent invitation. Marwen's legs were shaking, but she managed to climb down from the stone. She walked the last few feet that separated them, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm of disbelief and hope. She stopped just before him, looking up into the amber eyes that held her entire world. He reached out and gently, so gently, cupped her jaw. His calloused thumb stroked her cheek, wiping away a smudge of soot. The touch was not a brand of possession or a jolt of raw magic. It was a simple, profound connection. It was reverence. "You," he whispered, his voice rough with an emotion too deep for words. "It was always you." And then, in the heart of the smoky, blood-soaked clearing, surrounded by the wreckage of their past and the uncertainty of their future, he lowered his head, and finally, after 5 long years of silence and sorrow, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of homecoming. It was the taste of rain and regret, of iron and absolution. It was the closing of a circle, the end of a war, and the beginning of everything. The moon was not in the sky, but in that moment, she knew it was watching, and it remembered. The world after the battle was a place of hushed sounds and sharp, clean scents. The storm had washed the air, leaving behind the smell of damp earth, bruised pine, and the lingering, acrid tang of wood smoke. Inside Elspeth's tent, a small fire crackled, casting a warm, flickering light on the hide walls. The air was thick with the scent of crushed herbs and brewing willow bark tea. Marwen knelt on a fur pallet, her movement slow and deliberate as she finished wrapping a clean linen bandage around Rowan's forearm. The gash was deep, a vicious tear from a silver-tipped blade, but Elspeth's poultice had already stemmed the worst of the bleeding. He sat on a low stool, his leather armor removed, his bare torso a landscape of old scars and new bruises. He was utterly still, watching her, his amber eyes holding a quiet intensity that was more profound than his earlier rage had ever been. The bond between them was a gentle, steady warmth, a calm river after a flash flood. It was no longer a source of pain or a starving, desperate thing. It was simply present, a quiet, undeniable truth that connected the rhythm of her pulse to his. She tied off the bandage, her fingers brushing against his skin. The simple contact sent a soft, pleasant hum through her, a murmur of recognition and belonging. His hand came up and covered hers, his large, calloused palm engulfing her smaller one. His touch was warm, grounding. "Your song," he said, his voice a low rumble, stripped of its kingly command, and left with only the man. "I have never felt anything like it. It was like pouring strength directly into my soul. And I felt your fight," she whispered, meeting his gaze. "Every blow, every wound. I thought it would break me." "It didn't," he stated, a note of awe in his voice. "It made you stronger. You stood on that stone, and you became the fire. You became the heart of the storm." He lifted her hand, turning it over to press a soft kiss into the center of her palm. "You saved them. You saved me." The words settled into the hollow spaces inside her, the ones that had been carved out by years of scorn and self-doubt, and filled them with a light she had never known. She wasn't a liability. She wasn't a weakness. She was a power unto herself. Before she could respond, the flap of the tent was pushed aside. Alpha Borin stood there, his face streaked with soot, his expression a complex mixture of exhaustion, respect, and profound uncertainty. He did not look at Rowan. His eyes were fixed on Marwen. "The fire is contained," he reported, his voice rough. "The hunters are gone. We have 5 dead, a dozen wounded." He swallowed, the sound loud in the quiet tent. "The pack is asking for you." Rowan's grip on her hand tightened slightly, a protective gesture, but he remained silent, letting the choice be hers. This was her pack, her reckoning. Marwen nodded slowly and rose to her feet. With Rowan's hand still holding hers, she walked out of the tent and into the clearing. The pack was gathered, their faces smudged and weary, their eyes reflecting the morning's grim work. As she and Rowan emerged, a hush fell over them. They stood together, the wolfless Omega and the Alpha King, their joined hands a clear, undeniable statement. She saw Torvin and Lyra in the crowd. They stood near the back, their faces pale. Lyra wouldn't meet her eyes, her gaze fixed on the muddy ground. Torvin stared, his mouth slightly agape, the brutish confidence he always wore, completely gone, replaced by a dawning, fearful comprehension. Marwen let go of Rowan's hand and took a step forward, alone. She looked at the faces of the people who had mocked her, ignored her, and pitied her. She felt no anger, no need for vengeance, only a vast, quiet sense of a chapter closing. "Today, we bled together," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the clearing without the aid of magic. "We fought for our homes, for our families. The courage of the Black Creek Pack will be a story told in the North for a long time to come. We honor our dead, we tend to our wounded, and we rebuild." It was the speech of a Luna, a leader. It was spoken with an authority they had never heard from her, an authority born not of a title, but of a spirit that had been tested in fire and had not broken. Alpha Borin stepped forward, and, to the astonishment of the entire pack, he lowered his head in a gesture of profound respect. "Your voice saved us, Marwen Kaldis," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We were lost. You called us home." One by one, the other shifters lowered their heads. It was a silent, powerful apology, a recognition of her true worth, a worth that had nothing to do with a wolf or a scent, but with the strength of her heart. Later, as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the recovering camp, she and Rowan sat on the high, rocky outcrop where he had first found her. The world below was a tapestry of green and brown, peaceful now. "They see you now," he said, his voice soft as he watched his people, her people working together to clear the debris. "I see myself now," she corrected him gently. "That is the bigger difference." She looked at him, at the strong, scarred profile of the king who had carried their broken bond like a shard of glass in his heart for 5 long years. "What happens now, Rowan? Your kingdom is waiting." He turned to face her, taking both of her hands in his. "My kingdom needs a queen." Her breath hitched. "A queen who has no wolf? Whose only power is a song? Your council will never accept it. Your enemies will see it as the very weakness you feared." "Let them," he said, his amber eyes burning with a fierce, unwavering conviction. "For 5 years, I ruled with fear and iron. I built walls and fortresses. I thought strength was the absence of weakness. I was a fool." He squeezed her hands. "You taught me that true strength is not the armor we wear, but the heart we are willing to show. My kingdom does not need another warrior. It needs a heart. It needs a song to remind it what it is fighting for." He reached into his tunic and pulled out the small, tarnished silver locket. He opened it, revealing the 2 small portraits of the boy and girl they had been. "He made her a promise," Rowan whispered, his thumb stroking the image of the smiling girl. "He got lost in his duties, in his crown, in his fear. He let the world tell him that his promise was a liability." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, full of the weight of his regret and the light of his hope. He was wrong. It was never a liability. It was his compass, and it has finally pointed him home. He closed the locket and held it out to her. "I am not asking you to be my ghost, Marwen. I am asking you to be my queen, to stand beside me, not behind me, to let your voice be the law of my heart and the soul of our people. Come home with me." Tears she hadn't realized she was holding back welled in her eyes, blurring his beloved, earnest face. The wind, the same lonely wind that had once been her only companion, wrapped around them like a gentle embrace. She thought of the long years of silence, of the ache of her phantom wolf, of the scorn that had been her daily bread. And she thought of this man, this king, who had torn them both apart to save her, and who was now willing to face down his entire world to put her back together, at his side. There was only one answer. There had only ever been one answer. "Yes," she whispered, the word a song in itself. "Yes, I'll come home." He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 5 years. A slow, beautiful smile transformed his harsh features, erasing the scars and the sorrows, revealing the man she had fallen in love with under a summer moon. He leaned in and pressed his forehead against hers. their eyes closed, their breath mingling in the clean mountain air. The bond between them settled into a deep, quiet, and unbreakable peace. The past was a scar, but it was no longer a wound. The future was an unknown country, but they would walk into it together. Here, on the edge of the world, where her song of sorrow had once summoned a king, they found the beginning of a new hymn, one not of longing, but of belonging, and it was a song they would sing together for all the moons to come.